chief rabbi of the holy city of Tzfat, Shmuel Eliyahu, who openly calls for killing up to a million Palestinians in this discourse. In 2010, he organized hundreds of chief rabbis around the country. These are all rabbis on the public payroll, paid from my taxes, of course, to author a religious edict. And according to this edict, it instructed Jewish people that they are forbidden by law to sell or to even rent apartments to non-Jews and Palestinians specifically. This is a quote from the religious edict, and what's even especially nasty about it is that in the quote, in the edict rather, it says, well, the reason why we say this is because it says in the Bible, give them no respite, and it's a quote from the Bible. And I'm going to have to break down a few of the terms because we heard earlier from the brother who spoke about incitement. Sometimes it's very clear-cut and anyone can decipher it, and other times it's coded language. All right, some esoteric references. So I'm going to break some of those down to help members of the jury understand. So when he says, give them no respite, they're talking about Deuteronomy chapter 7, which is specifically a call for ethnic cleansing. It's specifically a call to enter the land and drive out all of the non-Israelite people in the land. So these rabbis are specifically making reference to that as their justification, okay? You have, in the last few years, also state-funded Rabbi Yitzhak Shapira authoring a book called The King's Torah, Torat HaMelech, which essentially breaks down the question, under which conditions is it permissible to murder Palestinians, to kill Palestinians? Essentially, the conclusion he comes to is just about every circumstance, even Palestinian babies, if you can imagine that. And this is a quote from the text, all right? Again, these are state-funded rabbis and no repercussions. They aren't tried, they aren't charged or brought to court for these kinds of statements. So this is in the lead-up to the war. Of course, infamously, Ovadia Yosef, he just, according to him, he was quoted as saying that Goyim, which is a term for non-Jewish people, were born only to serve us. Without that, they have no place in the world. And about Palestinians specifically, or Arabs rather, you must send missiles to annihilate them. So again, this is not a marginal character. He passed on just a few months ago, the head of the Shas, spiritual head of the Shas party, but his funeral was attended by 800,000 people. It was the largest funeral in the history of the country by far. So you understand how popular views like this become. It's not only coming from religious figures, you also have political figures who are ostensibly secular, like the mayor of Upper Nazareth, Shimon Gapsa, who openly says, yes, we're not going to build any, 20% of the population of his town is Palestinian, but he says, no, we're not going to allow any Arab-speaking schools, and proudly proclaims in an op-ed in Haaretz, yes, I am a racist, I'm proud of it, and there's no shame around it. Danny Danon, up-and-coming lawmaker, just until recently deputy defense minister of the country, says the biggest problem in the state of Israel is the Arabs of Israel. So with proclamations like this from religious and political officials, this is, and nothing being done to stem the tide, this is the fertile ground from which we enter Operation Protective Edge. I should just say that recently, in 2012, there was another spate of violence towards Palestinians in Israel. This man, young man Jamal Julani, was beaten practically to death by a group of Israeli Jews in downtown Jerusalem, middle of downtown Jerusalem. After doing it, they didn't even flee. They just stood there. And they said, why are you even reviving him? The police came. They weren't afraid. They knew there were no repercussions. They even admitted it on tape. They confessed to the police. Of course, the police lost the tapes. So, but after this beating and a few other beatings, very intense attacks on Palestinians in Israel, a left-wing lawmaker sought to propose that there would be just 1 hour a week of anti-racist education in Israel, that schools would put aside just 1 hour a week. Unfortunately, the entire government voted against it. Even the so-called center parties voted against just 1 hour a week of anti-racist education. So efforts to stem the tide of incitement are for naught. This is a part of the law that he proposed. So now we're coming up on protective edge. You have the head of a yeshiva, a religious seminary in Israel, praising Shlomo ben Yosef. Okay? But what happens is the bodies of these three boys, these three teenagers, are found. And that triggers an avalanche of incitement. And so you have the head of a religious seminary praising this man who historically in pre-state history, he threw a grenade onto a bus full of Palestinians. And he chose that particular moment of discovering the bodies to praise this man who united all the Jews. Up-and-coming lawmaker Ayelet Shaked, the whip for the Jewish home faction of the government, writes on Facebook, "Who is the enemy? The Palestinian people are all enemy combatants. This also includes the mothers." Okay? And this is just, people are pushed into a rage. I mean, it's already on the streets. And true, fair enough, a lot of the time we think of the people who initiate street-level violence as being like, you know, young, adolescent males, football hooligans. And sure enough, you go to any football stadium, especially in Jerusalem, and you'll see signs and chants, like right here, "No Arabs, we'll be pure forever." Okay? And of course, "Death to the Arabs," chanted. But it's not only people that look like this. In the few hours and the days and the weeks that followed the discovery of these teenagers' bodies, you had Israelis from across the society posting selfies of themselves with messages advocating vengeance, revenge, and essentially murdering Palestinians. So here you see someone, death to all the terrorists and leftists. And his daughters, presumably his daughters' shoes are in the corner. So clearly this is not some kind of, 18-year-old raging hormone. This is a family man, That's the point where we're at, where it's acceptable for any segment of society. And it's not just men, it's women too, posting their revenge selfies. And, for example, this one made the rounds quite a bit. Hating Arabs isn't racism, it's values. And these are the kinds of selfies people were posting, in their own names. Even if you can imagine taking your own child and putting a sign on it, holding up a sign saying, "Netanyahu, the people demand revenge," and then posting a photo of your child on the internet. There's just no shame around this discourse. So you have people heading into the streets and combing the streets all across the country, but especially in Jerusalem, and chanting "Death to the Arabs," chanting, demanding revenge, just mobs of people, dozens, hundreds of people screaming this. And at this critical moment, what does the Prime Minister choose to do? Call for vengeance. Sure enough, vengeance for the blood of a small child Satan has not yet created. I guess that's his way of saying the worst will befall these people, feeding the fire. And that's exactly what he did. Netanyahu's words were the fuel for the fire of Mohammed Abu Khdeir, who was grabbed in front of his parents' home, beaten, gasoline poured down his throat, and he was burnt to death from the inside out. Now, after it happened, more incitement. What do you see on the internet? This passed around. It's a message saying, "Here's the Arab fag who was murdered by Arabs over family honor, but the left blames us." So quickly there's a narrative on the Israeli right. Oh, not only, are these Arab people evil, but they're trying to pin on us the fact that we killed them. And in fact, it was the Arabs themselves who killed them, because this is, feeding homophobia, feeding into the racism and coalescing in a potent cocktail of hatred. And of course, it turned out that this was the man who did it, who, again, admitted it to the police. Apparently, there's a confession. It's not apparently, it's been released to the media. It's no secret. This man and a group of other Jewish Israelis